He threw her out of his country. He erased her name from his life. He told himself it was necessary, that she was a threat, a liability, a mistake. Jin Tae-woo, the most feared mafia boss in Seoul, believed he had made the right call. He always did. But the night he walked into his mother's hidden estate and heard the sound of 3 newborn babies crying in the dark, everything he thought he knew about power, loyalty, and what it means to be a man collapsed in a single breath. Because standing beside those cribs was the woman he had destroyed. And she was not there to beg. She was there to make him understand exactly what he had thrown away. What? If this story already has you, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments below, and follow so you never miss a single part. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The rain came down hard over Seoul that Tuesday night, the kind of rain that turned the Han River black and made the streets look like the city was bleeding from somewhere deep underneath. Jin Tae-woo sat in the back of his armored Mercedes with his jacket open and his tie loosened, watching the city slide past the tinted windows like a film he had already seen too many times. His phone had been buzzing for the last 40 minutes. He didn't look at it. His driver, a compact man named Park Sung-il, who had worked for the Jin family for 11 years and knew better than to speak unless spoken to, kept his eyes on the road. The wipers beat a steady rhythm against the glass. Neither man said a word. Tae-woo was 35 years old, and he looked it now in a way he hadn't 2 years ago. There was something behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. A particular kind of stillness that had nothing to do with peace. His face was still sharp, still the kind of face that made men lower their voices when he entered a room, but the lines around his mouth had deepened and the muscle along his jaw never fully unclenched anymore. People in his world called that look composure. His mother had a different word for it. She called it damage. The car turned off the main highway and onto the narrower road that wound up through the pine-covered hills south of the city. Tae-woo finally picked up his phone and scrolled through the messages without reading them. There were 14 from his operations director, Kwon Dae-jung, 2 from his legal counsel, 1 from a number he didn't recognize with a Busan area code, and then, at the very top of the queue, a message from his mother that said only, "Come tonight, use the East Gate, come alone." That was unusual enough to make him sit forward. Madame Seomira did not send text messages. She communicated through proxies, through formal telephone calls, through handwritten notes delivered by staff who had signed non-disclosure agreements and understood the consequences of violating them. The fact that she had sent a text herself from her personal device using a construction as spare and direct as "come alone," that meant something. He just didn't know yet what. He told Sung-il to take the East Gate Road. They drove in silence for another 12 minutes. The estate sat behind 3 meters of stone wall draped with old climbing vines. The wall itself invisible from the road during daylight and effectively non-existent at night. Tae-woo had grown up inside those walls. He had learned to walk on the flagstone paths between the main house and the water garden. He had sat on the stone steps of the east portico the night his father died, and watched the sky turn colors and felt absolutely nothing, which had frightened him more than the grief would have. He knew every room in that house. He knew where the floor creaked and where the shadows pooled and which windows his mother kept unlocked. He had not been here in 4 months. The gate opened before the car reached it. The guards had been watching, and Sung-il pulled through without stopping and followed the inner road to the east entrance. No other vehicles were visible. The main house lights were low. 2 staff members Tae-woo didn't recognize stood at the entrance doors without making eye contact, and one of them stepped forward to open his car door. "Madame Seo is in the nursery wing," the man said quietly. Tae-woo got out of the car. He stood there in the rain for a moment without moving. "The nursery wing," he repeated. "Yes, sir." The nursery wing was the oldest part of the house, a 2-story extension off the northeast corner that hadn't been used in over 20 years. Tae-woo had been born there. So had his younger sister, who had died of a fever at 14 months. His mother had closed that part of the house after the funeral, and to Tae-woo's knowledge, had never reopened it. He walked through the east entrance and down the corridor that ran the length of the main floor, his dress shoes making a sound on the stone floor that he was suddenly aware of, a hollow clip-clop that seemed too loud for the hour. The house smelled of old wood and something else, something warmer and unfamiliar, something that didn't belong to the estate as he remembered it. He passed the formal dining room, the secondary study, the door to the wine cellar, and then turned at the northeast junction where the air changed temperature and he could see light coming from under the closed doors at the far end of the corridor. He could hear something. He stopped walking. The sound was soft, layered. Not a single voice, but several, overlapping and intermittent, rising and falling in a pattern that was somehow both chaotic and rhythmic. It took him a full 4 seconds to identify what it was because it was so far outside the context of everything he associated with this house, this night, this city. It was the sound of infants crying. He stood completely still in the middle of that corridor for a moment that felt much longer than it was, his body processing what his mind hadn't yet authorized. His right hand had moved slightly toward the inside of his jacket without him consciously deciding that, an old reflex, and he pulled it back down and made himself breathe. Then he walked forward and opened the door. The nursery had been completely transformed. The dusty furniture and drop cloths he might have expected were gone. The room was warm and carefully lit. 3 separate cribs arranged in a careful arc near the far wall. Medical equipment he couldn't name standing at measured intervals. A rocking chair positioned between the second and third crib. There was a changing station. There were stacked soft blankets in pale yellow and white. There was a framed photograph on the wall above the cribs that he couldn't make out from the doorway. His mother stood near the window with her arms folded, wearing a dark robe and no jewelry, watching him with the expression she used when she already knew how a conversation was going to end. And standing beside the second crib, with her hand resting gently on its rail, wearing a pale gray cardigan over a hospital-style undershirt, with her hair pulled back and her face carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had not slept more than 2 consecutive hours in recent memory, was Zuri Coleman. She looked at him the way you look at someone you have already grieved. Taewoo's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "Close the door," his mother said. He closed it. The crying had softened. 2 of the infants had settled back toward sleep, and the third made a small, repetitive sound that Zuri responded to without looking away from Taewoo, reaching into the crib and adjusting something, her hand moving with the practiced economy of someone who had been doing this for weeks. The infant quieted. Zuri straightened. The silence in the room was a physical presence. "How?" Taewoo finally said. It wasn't really a question. It was the only syllable his mind could produce. "Sit down," his mother said. "I'm not going to sit down." "Taewoo?" "How long?" he said, and this time it was directed at Zuri, who had not moved, who was watching him with those dark eyes that had always been able to locate something in him that he preferred to keep buried. "How long have they been here?" 3 weeks, Zuri said. Her voice was low and unhurried, and there was nothing in it that suggested she was afraid of him. There had never been anything in her voice that suggested that, which was one of the reasons he had married her and one of the reasons he had let himself be convinced that she was dangerous. They were born 6 weeks premature. They're doing well now. All 3 of them. All 3. He looked at the cribs. He hadn't been able to make himself look directly at them since he'd entered the room, the way you can't look directly at something that might completely rearrange your internal architecture if you do. Now he looked. 3 cribs. 3 small forms, 2 already still, 1 still making soft, restless sounds. He could see a hand, 1 tiny hand curled against a pale blanket like a fist that had given up on whatever it was holding. He looked back at Zuri. "You were pregnant," he said, "when I sent you out." "Yes." The word landed in the room like a stone hitting still water. "You knew." "I found out in Washington." She said it without accusation, without theatrical weight, just the fact, delivered flat. "I was gone 2 weeks before I knew for certain." He turned to his mother. Madame Seomi Ra, 71 years old, former co-architect of the Jin family syndicate, a woman who had survived 3 separate attempts on her life, and had never once in Taewoo's memory asked for help from anyone, was watching him with an expression he could only describe as patient. Not soft, not forgiving, patient. The way you look at someone who has broken something valuable and is only just now beginning to understand what it was. "You knew," he said to her. "You knew before tonight." "I've known since Zuri contacted my emergency line," she said. "That was approximately 7 months ago." 7 months. He turned away from both of them and faced the wall. His right hand went to the back of his neck, which was something he did when the landscape of a situation had shifted beneath him faster than he could adjust to. And he pressed hard against the muscles there and breathed through his nose and tried to locate the part of his mind that dealt with facts and sequences instead of the part that was currently doing something he had no useful name for. 7 months. His mother had known for 7 months. She had brought Zuri back into the country, into this house, had overseen the pregnancy, the birth, the first weeks of his children's lives, and had said nothing to him. He had sat across from her at dinner 3 months ago. He had called her every Sunday. He had run 2 separate operational crises through her counsel, and she had never once. "Why?" he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Because I needed to know if you deserved to," she said simply. He turned back around. "That's not your decision to make." "It was the only decision I could make," she said, and now there was something harder in her voice, something that had been waiting to come out. "You signed deportation papers without reading them. You took the word of someone in your inner circle over the word of your wife. You put Zuri on a plane without once asking her directly what she had or hadn't done." She paused. "You made that easy for your enemies, Tae-woo. So yes, I decided that my grandchildren would not be made easy for anyone." The room was very quiet. One of the infants stirred. Zuri moved to the crib automatically, made a small adjustment. The infant settled. Tae-woo watched her hands. She knew what she was doing. She had been doing this alone. With his mother's support, yes, but alone in the way that mattered, the way that counted, the way that built the particular kind of ownership over something that no legal document or bloodline claim could override. "Zuri," he said. She turned. "I need you to understand that I didn't—" "No," she said quietly. "Not tonight." He stopped. "I am not doing this tonight." Her voice was still calm, still that low, unhurried register, but there was something beneath it now that had teeth. "My children are 3 weeks old. 2 of them came home from the NICU 8 days ago. I have had approximately 14 hours of sleep in the last 2 weeks, and I have been managing their feeds on a 2.5-hour rotation, and I have been doing all of that inside a house that isn't mine, in a country that tried to remove me from it, with your mother's staff walking in and out at all hours." She paused, just briefly. "So whatever explanation you came here to give me, it keeps. Tonight, it keeps." He didn't say anything. Madame Seo watched both of them. "There's a room prepared for you in the West Wing," she told Tae-woo. "You'll stay tonight." "You'll stay tonight," she said again, in the tone she had used since he was 7 years old, that meant the conversation on this particular point was finished. He stayed. He didn't sleep. He lay on the bed in the West Wing guest room, with his jacket hanging over the chair back and his shoes still on, and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house breathe around him. Somewhere down the hall and around 2 corridors, his children were sleeping in their cribs. His children. The phrase felt foreign in his mind, like a word in a language he understood technically, but had no native fluency in. He turned it over, tried to find the edges of it. 3 weeks old. Born 6 weeks premature. He didn't know what that meant in terms of risk, in terms of what they had needed or what they might still need. He didn't know if they had names yet. He hadn't asked and no one had told him. He lay there and thought about that, about the fact that he had 3 children and he didn't know if they had names. And something moved through his chest that he refused to identify. At some point before dawn, he got up and walked. The house was quiet at that hour. The staff retired. Only the security rotation moving at regular intervals through the grounds outside. He walked the main corridor slowly, passing the rooms he had grown up inside. The photographs of people he had memorized in childhood and could now only half remember the stories behind. His father. His father's father. A photograph of his parents on their wedding day that had always seemed to belong to a different family than the one Tae-woo had actually inhabited. He found himself at the northeast corridor, at the door to the nursery wing. He stood there for a long moment, his hand not quite on the door handle. Then he heard it. A voice. Very low, very quiet, coming from inside. Not crying this time. Something else. A sound he recognized belatedly as someone talking to infants who couldn't yet understand language. The particular rhythm of it, the soft rise and fall. Zuri's voice, so she was awake. She was with them. He stood in the corridor and listened to the sound of her talking to his children through a closed door and did not open it. He didn't have the right. He understood that with a clarity that had nothing to do with law or bloodline. Whatever rights he thought his biology conferred on him had been suspended the moment he'd put her on a plane without asking a single question, and the reinstatement of those rights was not something he was going to accomplish in a single night by standing outside a door feeling things he had no language for. He went back to the West Wing. He sat on the edge of the bed and took out his phone and scrolled back through the months, through the messages he had sent and received in the weeks after Zuri left, through the operational reports and the emergency calls and the 14-hour days he had used to fill the space she had occupied. He looked at the last message she had sent him. He had never replied to it. He had told himself there was nothing to say. The message said, "I left my ring on your desk. I want you to know I didn't steal anything from you except the years I gave you, and you can't get those back. Take care of yourself." Z. He had read it maybe 100 times over the months and had not answered it once. Now he sat in the guest room of his mother's estate with his 3 premature children asleep 40 meters down the hall and thought about the particular brutality of being a man who was very good at making decisions and very bad at understanding what those decisions cost. By the time the sky began to lighten outside the window, he had thought about Yoon Hye-jin. He'd thought about her the way you think about a piece of information that hadn't seemed important when you received it, but had been nagging at the back of your mind ever since. Hye-jin was his senior operations advisor, had been for 6 years. She had come up through the syndicate's intelligence arm, the daughter of a former lieutenant, sharp and precise and utterly without sentiment in the way that made her valuable for the kind of work that required someone who could separate analysis from emotion. He had trusted her. He had trusted her because she had never given him a reason not to, and because she had always been there when he needed clarity, and because in his world you trusted people with track records, and you didn't examine the machinery of that trust too closely because the examination itself created vulnerabilities. She had been the one to bring him the report on Zuri. She had been the one to compile the intelligence suggesting that Zuri had been feeding information to a rival faction, that her close relationship with a man named Marcus Webb, an American consultant who had been brought in by one of Tae-woo's legitimate business partners, had crossed a line from professional into something else, something that could compromise the family's security. The report had been detailed and specific, with timestamps and surveillance photographs and cross-referenced communications. It had been thorough enough that Tae-woo had not gone looking for a second opinion. He thought about that now. About the fact that he had not gone looking for a second opinion. He thought about the surveillance photographs, about the angle and framing of them, about the particular moments they had captured, about how easily a photograph could be curated to construct a narrative, about how a man with a certain kind of pride about his own intelligence could be made to carry water for someone else's agenda without ever knowing he was doing it. He had still been sitting on the edge of the bed when Sung-il appeared at the guest room door at 6:15 in the morning to tell him that a car had arrived at the east gate. "Who?" Tae-woo said. "Miss Yoon, sir?" He stood up. Hye-jin had come to the estate. She had come early in the morning without being summoned, using the same gate code that Tae-woo himself had used, which meant she had either obtained that code from someone inside his mother's security apparatus or she had followed him here. Neither answer was comfortable. He told Sung-il to have her brought to the main study and to make sure no one else entered that room. He put his jacket back on. He checked the inside pocket. He walked down the corridor to the main study and arrived 30 seconds before Hye-jin was shown in. She was dressed in business casual, dark trousers, a cream-colored blouse, with her hair up and her face composed in the way it always was, that particular blankness that he had always read as professionalism. She was 33, slim and precise in her movements, and she scanned the room when she entered the way she always did, a quick tactical assessment, and then she saw Tae-woo's face and something shifted. Not much, barely perceptible, but he saw it. "You're here early," he said. "I needed to speak with you." She didn't sit. Neither did he. They stood on opposite sides of the desk. "I got word last night that Madame Seo had brought someone onto the estate. I needed to know if it was a security concern." "Who told you that?" A pause. "One of the gate staff. He was concerned." "Which one?" Another pause. Marginally longer this time. "Minjun Seo." Tae-woo filed that name in the part of his mind that kept accounts. "And why?" he said carefully. Would you consider a visitor to my mother's estate to be a security concern requiring your personal attention at 6 in the morning? Because of who she is. Hyejin's voice was steady. She was good. She had always been good. I ran the gate log. I know it's Zuri Coleman. I know you didn't sanction her return. A beat. Or did you? No, he said. I didn't. She read something in that answer that made her relax fractionally. Too soon. Then I think we should discuss how she came to be here and what her intentions are, Hyejin said. She was removed from the country for significant reasons. If she's back, tell me about Marcus Webb, Tae-woo said. The silence was different this time. It wasn't the silence of someone thinking about what to say. It was the silence of someone who had been expecting something to come from a different direction and had just realized it was coming from the direction they couldn't cover. I told you about Webb in the report, she said. Tell me again. Specifically, how did you develop the surveillance on him? Who were your secondary sources for the communication intercepts? Tae-woo, the photographs, he said. The one showing Zuri and Webb at the hotel in Itaewon. Who took those photographs? Our surveillance team. Which team? Name me the operative. Her mouth closed. He watched her. He had been watching her for the last 20 seconds with the specific quality of attention he reserved for moments when the architecture of something was becoming visible, when the scaffolding that had been holding up a false structure was starting to show through the facade. He had that feeling now, that particular cold clarity. You've been in this house for 4 minutes, he said quietly, and you haven't asked me once what is actually here. You haven't asked why my mother brought Zuri back. You haven't asked if there's a child. He let that sit for 1 second. You already knew. Her face didn't move. She was genuinely exceptional at this. You knew Zuri was pregnant when she left, he said, and you came here this morning because something changed in the calculation. I came here because... Stop. He said it without raising his voice. I'm going to ask you one question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer it. Not because your answer will change what I already know, but because what you say next will determine how I choose to handle what comes after. He moved around the side of the desk, not toward her, just moving, reorienting the space. Who gave you the original intelligence that you built the Zuri report on? The morning light was coming in through the study windows now, pale and clean. Somewhere deep in the house, far off, one of the infants had begun to cry. Hyejin heard it. He watched her hear it, and in that moment, for just a fraction of a second before she rebuilt her composure, she looked afraid. Not of him. He knew what fear of him looked like. She was afraid of something else, something or someone that operated in the space behind her, behind the version of this story she had been telling herself, something she had not fully looked at directly. I need time, she said quietly. You don't have time, he said. The person you're protecting has already moved. He didn't actually know that yet, but he watched her face and he saw the confirmation of it, saw her absorb the statement not as a possibility, but as a fact, saw her chest rise and fall once with something that looked like a woman realizing she had been outmaneuvered by the same person she thought she'd been protecting herself from. He said Zuri was a risk, she said. Her voice had changed. The professional blankness was still there, but something underneath it had cracked. He had documentation. Dates, communication logs. He told me your marriage was making you vulnerable. Who? She looked at him. In that moment, with the morning light and the distant sound of crying and the weight of everything this room was sitting on top of, all the months and the decisions and the damage, Yoon Hye-jin looked like exactly what she was. Someone who had believed she was making a controlled choice and had only just discovered that the choice had been made for her. Baek Sung-hwan, she said. The name dropped into Tae-woo's chest like a coal. Baek Sung-hwan, director of the syndicate's financial operations, 12 years in the organization. A man Tae-woo's father had personally elevated, who had sat at every strategic table for a decade, who held structural knowledge of the Jin family's finances that no one outside a small inner circle possessed, who had dined with Tae-woo 6 weeks ago and asked after his mother's health, and poured the man's own wine and told him the syndicate's year-end numbers were strong. The crying down the hall had stopped. Taewoo stood in the middle of the study and felt the particular sensation of a man who has just looked down and realized that the ground he has been standing on was never solid, that what he took for bedrock was always something else, something constructed specifically to support his weight just long enough. "Get out," he said to Hyejin. Not violently, not with the particular cold fury he sometimes used as a tool. Just the word, in a low voice, from a man who needed to be alone with what he had just learned. She left. He stood at the window for a long time, watching the estate's garden in the morning light, the wet flagstones, the water garden where nothing moved. He thought about Baek Sung-hwan. He thought about everything that name connected to. The financials, the ledgers, the business relationships, the political contacts, the people who had reason to want Baek elevated and others diminished. He thought about his children asleep in the nursery wing. He thought about Zuri standing at that crib rail in the pale light, looking at him like someone who had already done her grieving and was not interested in beginning it again. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. "Daejung," he said when his operations director picked up on the second ring. "I need everything we have on Baek Sung-hwan's private communications over the last 18 months, not the official channels, the secondary ones, and I need it by noon." A pause. "And then I need you to find out how deep it goes." He hung up. He stood at the window for another moment. Then he turned and walked back down the corridor toward the nursery wing. He didn't go in. He stood at the door again, one hand resting flat against the wood, and listened to the sound on the other side. Zuri's voice again, low and continuous, the small sounds of morning with his children in it. He had a war to plan. He had a betrayal to map and dismantle and answer. He had an entire infrastructure of lies to excavate and a man at the center of it who had eaten dinner at his table 6 weeks ago. But first he stood at that door and listened, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific weight of something worth fighting for. He didn't open the door. He wasn't ready. And she had told him clearly that tonight, that this moment, was not his yet. But his hand stayed on the wood for a long time before he finally pulled it away. Down the hall, through the walls of the house, through every calculation and betrayal and ruined year between where he had been and where he was standing right now, one of his children made a sound. A single bright sound, brief and formless, not crying, not settled. Something in between, something unresolved, something still becoming. He listened to it until it stopped. Then he turned and walked back toward the east wing, where his phone was already ringing, where Daejung was already pulling threads, where the war that had been building in the shadows of his own house for over a year was about to step into the light. And Baek Sung-hwan, sitting somewhere in Seoul at that same hour, in a tailored suit with his measured smile and his 12 years of accumulated leverage, did not yet know that the man he had underestimated had just found the first loose thread. He would know soon enough. Kwon Dae-jung arrived at the estate at 11:47 in the morning, driving himself, which meant whatever he had found was not something he was willing to put in a message or hand to a courier. He was a thick-shouldered man in his mid-40s with a face that had been broken and reset at least twice, and a manner of moving through spaces that suggested he was always calculating the fastest route to the nearest exit. He had worked directly under Tae-woo for 8 years. He did not rattle easily. He rattled now. Tae-woo met him in the East Garden rather than inside the house, standing on the wet flagstones with a cup of coffee he hadn't drunk going cold in his hand. The morning had burned off into a gray midday, the kind of flat soul overcast that pressed down on everything and made distances look shorter than they were. Dae-jung handed him a sealed folder without preamble. 18 months of secondary communications, he said, keeping his voice low even though there was no one within 30 meters of them. Baek has a private line running through a shell registered in Singapore. It's been active since before your father died. Tae-woo looked at him. Before my father died, he repeated. Yes. He opened the folder. The top sheet was a communication log. Dates, durations, routing codes. He scanned it. The Singapore number appeared on average 3 times a week, sometimes more during specific windows that Tae-woo was already beginning to mentally cross-reference against events from the past 2 years. Strategic meetings, operational shifts, the timing of certain problems that had emerged and been resolved in ways that, looking back now with different eyes, had always tilted slightly in Baek's direction. The Singapore line, Tae-woo said, where does it terminate? That's where it gets complicated. Daejung reached across and turned to the third page. The routing goes Singapore, then Macau, then it splits into two separate numbers. One of them we tracked back to a logistics company in Incheon that has 3 known connections to the Choi faction. Tae-woo went very still, but the Choi faction was the second largest criminal organization operating in Seoul, a rival syndicate that had been attempting to absorb pieces of the Jin family's territory for 4 years through a combination of legitimate business acquisition and deliberate low-level destabilization. They had never mounted a direct confrontation. They were too careful for that, too structurally conservative, but they had applied consistent pressure in specific areas that Tae-woo had always attributed to opportunism. He was now considering a different word for it. "And the second number," he said. Daejung's jaw moved. "We're still working on it, but the area code puts it somewhere in the greater Seoul metro. Private residential registration, name on the account is a woman who died in 2019. A dead woman's name, which meant someone had been operating behind a ghost identity for at least 5 years, possibly longer, with enough administrative access to maintain a residential phone registration that hadn't triggered any of the syndicate's standard surveillance sweeps, which meant that person had either an exceptional understanding of how those sweeps worked, or they had been in a position to design around them. Pull Beck's access logs for the last 6 months, Tae-woo said. Everything he's touched, not just communications, financial authorizations, personnel movements, the forwarded intelligence reports." He closed the folder. "And find out who has the second number." "That's going to take time. We might not." "Then start now," Tae-woo said quietly. And Daejung left. He stood in the garden alone and let the information settle. The cold coffee was still in his hand. He set it down on the edge of the stone planter and watched the water garden where the surface was gray and flat and completely undisturbed. And he thought about Baek Sung-hwan's face across a dinner table 6 weeks ago. The measured smile. The way the man had filled his wine glass without asking if he wanted more. A small, intimate gesture that said, "I know you. I am trusted here. I belong at this table." 12 years. In 12 years, Baek had never given him a reason. The best kind of betrayal never gave you reasons. He heard the door behind him open. He didn't turn around. He knew from the sound of the footsteps, or rather the deliberate precision of them, the specific way they landed on stone, who it was. His mother stopped a few feet away and stood beside him looking at the water garden. "You know," he said. "I suspected," she said. "For how long?" A pause. 18 months. Perhaps longer. There were patterns in the financial reporting that your father noticed in the last year before he died. He didn't tell you because he didn't have proof, and he didn't want to move you against a man prematurely. Another pause. And then your father died, and the patterns stopped being visible because Baek became responsible for the reports. Tae-woo turned and looked at her. "You think he—" "I think your father was a 64-year-old man with no significant health history who died very suddenly of cardiac failure," she said, her voice even and precise as a surgical instrument. "And I think that men like Baek Sung-hwan do not take risks unless the risk has been engineered to look like something else." The space between them was very quiet. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "Because you were grieving," she said. "And then you weren't grieving. You were running an organization at war with 3 fronts simultaneously. And you were also—" She paused briefly. "Navigating your marriage. I needed to know more before I put that weight on you. I needed more than suspicion. You've had 18 months of more than suspicion. I've had 18 months of a thread I couldn't pull without potentially unraveling everything you've built." She turned to look at him directly. "Beck holds the financial architecture. If I'd moved against him incorrectly, he could have collapsed 3 legitimate businesses and exposed the organization to regulatory scrutiny that would have taken years to survive." A beat. "I was waiting for a moment when we had enough to end it completely instead of just wound it." "And Zuri," he said. The word came out with more edge than he intended. "Her pregnancy. What happened to her?" "Was not something I engineered," his mother said sharply. "I brought her back because she contacted my emergency line and she was carrying my grandchildren and she had nowhere safe to go. That is the full extent of my calculation on that matter." She held his gaze. "What happened to her was Hyejin's work, and Hyejin was manipulated by Baek. The thread connects. But Zuri's suffering is not a variable I managed. I want that to be clear between us. He looked at her for a long moment and then looked away. Is it clear? She said. Yes, he said. She went back inside. He stayed in the garden until the cold got into his hands. At 1:15, Zuri appeared in the doorway to the east wing with a baby carrier strapped to her chest, and a look on her face that said she had come outside for air and had not expected to find him standing in the garden. She stopped in the doorway. The infant in the carrier, one of the girls, he would learn the names later, he promised himself that, was asleep against her chest, a small dark-haired head tucked under Zuri's chin. They looked at each other across maybe 15 meters of garden. I'm going to walk, she said. Not an invitation, just information. Okay, he said. He said. She walked along the south path that curved around the water garden, not toward him. He watched her. She was moving carefully, the way people move when they're carrying something fragile, and the weight is already more than they expected. Her face in profile was the face he had spent 2 years memorizing, and then 2 years trying to stop seeing in unguarded moments. The particular angle of her jaw, the way she held her chin slightly up when she was thinking about something difficult. He made himself stop watching her and go back inside. He spent the next 4 hours in the secondary study with Daijung's folder and 2 of his personal analysts who arrived from Seoul at 2 o'clock and set up a working surface on the study table. They worked in near silence, cross-referencing dates and pulling threads, building a physical timeline on the table surface with printouts and handwritten connectors. By 5 in the afternoon, the picture was not complete, but it was legible. Baek Sung-hwan had been passing information to the Choi faction for at least 20 months. The financial data he had been selectively adjusting in quarterly reports had been used to create an accurate picture of the Jin Syndicate's vulnerabilities, which territories were under-resourced, which partnerships were structurally fragile, which legitimate businesses were carrying hidden liabilities. The Choi faction had used that picture to apply pressure in exactly the right places at exactly the right moments. The destabilization had been slow and precise, like a man slowly drawing a foundation crack wider without ever touching the wall above it. And Taewoo's marriage had been a specific target. Not incidental, specific. The intelligence operation against Zuri had been designed to remove her from the equation before she became something that could stabilize Taewoo personally and operationally. A man with a settled family and a wife he trusted had a different psychological profile than a man alone, different blind spots, different pressure points. Baek had needed Taewoo isolated and emotionally cauterized. He had given Hyejin the tools to accomplish that without her ever knowing whose hand was on the trigger. Taewoo sat with that information for a long time after his analysts had stepped out. He had been managed. For the better part of 2 years, one of the men he trusted most had been carefully managing him, shaping what he knew, calibrating the emotional landscape around him, keeping him in exactly the psychological state that served someone else's strategic interests. He had been treated as an instrument by a man who sat at his table, and he had been expert enough at this work to never once feel the hands on him. That knowledge sat in Taewoo's chest with a specific density. He was not a man who used the word humiliation easily, but he used it now, sitting alone at the study table in the fading afternoon light, looking at the timeline spread out in front of him. Humiliation was accurate, and underneath it, pressing up through the floor of it, something much colder and much more purposeful. He was still sitting there when the door opened without a knock and Hyejin walked in. He looked up. She had changed clothes since the morning. Dark jacket now, her hair still up, but something in her bearing had shifted. She didn't look like the controlled, precise instrument he had known for 6 years. She looked like a woman who had spent the last 8 hours doing her own excavation and had not liked what she'd found. Sung-hwan killed my brother, she said from the doorway. Taewoo said nothing. 2 years ago. Her voice was flat, emptied out. My brother was running collections in Mapo. He told me he'd found evidence of money being redirected, not skimming, something larger, something systematic. He was going to bring it to you directly. She stopped, started again. Sung-hwan told me later that my brother had gotten involved with the Choi faction, that he had been a liability, that you had authorized the removal. The silence in the room stretched tight. I believed him, she said. I believed him because he had documentation, because he had your signature on an authorization order. She crossed her arms, not defensively, protectively, like someone holding their own ribs together. I know now that signature was forged. I've spent the last 4 hours comparing it against your actual authorization records, and the hand is wrong. The form is wrong. A breath. He gave me a fake document, and I used it to justify... She stopped. To justify what? Taewoo said. Everything I did to Zuri, she said. All of it. Every piece of intelligence I compiled. Every report I gave you. I thought I was doing what the organization required because the man who destroyed my family told me you had ordered it, and I... The control in her voice slipped for just a moment. A single visible fracture. I should have verified it. I should have come to you directly. I didn't because I was... She pressed her lips together hard. I was devastated and I was angry, and he handed me a target and I took it. Taewoo stood up from the table slowly. The forged authorization, he said. Where is it? I have it. Give it to Daijong tonight. All of it. Everything Sung Hwan ever gave you. Every document. Every verbal instruction you recorded. All of it goes to Daejong with a full written account. He looked at her across the table. You understand what that means for your position? Yes, she said. You're done at the operational level. That's not negotiable. I know. And the legal exposure, I know, she said again, harder this time. He nodded. She moved toward the door and then stopped, her hand on the frame, her back to him. Is she all right? She said, very quietly. He understood who she meant. The children are healthy, he said. A breath from her side of the room that might have been relief, or something more complicated. She deserved better than what I gave her, Hye-jin said. I know that doesn't... It doesn't, he agreed. But give Daejong what you have. She left. He stood at the study table and looked at the timeline and thought about how many points on it represented moments where a single different choice, by him, by Hye-jin, by his father, by anyone, would have altered the entire shape of what followed. The branching was maddening if you followed it backward far enough. He stopped following it backward. He needed to see Zuri. Not to explain himself, not yet. She had told him clearly that the explanations didn't come tonight, and he had decided that meant they came when she was ready to hear them, which was not a timeline he got to set. But he needed to say something. He was not sure what. He walked to the nursery wing anyway because not walking there felt like a choice he would regret, and he had enough of those already. The door was open this time. Partial. Not an invitation, but not a closed wall either. He could hear the sounds of the room from the corridor, the small domestic sounds of feeding time, a low murmur, a brief unhappy squeak from one of the infants followed by quiet. He pushed the door slightly wider and knocked on the frame. Zuri looked up from the nursing chair. She had the youngest on her arm. The smallest one, he could see now that they were 3 separate sizes, which his mind filed for later. She assessed him with one look the way she always had, that particular swift inventory that he had never been able to deceive, and then she looked back down at the baby. You found something, she said. Not a question. Yes. Is it going to get dangerous? He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. She absorbed that without visible reaction, smoothing the blanket over the infant with one careful hand. How dangerous? I don't know the full shape of it yet. Daijong is still pulling threads. But someone inside the organization? Yes. She was quiet for a moment. The baby made a small sound. She adjusted. The children need to stay here, she said, at the estate. Yes, this is the safest location right now. And me, she still wasn't looking at him. I stay too. Zuri, that's not a negotiation, she said quietly. I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you that I am not moving my children while there's an active threat inside your organization, because the last time there was a threat inside your organization, you put me on a plane and didn't look back. She glanced up at him then, briefly, and her eyes were not cold exactly. They were something more precise than cold. So I stay, and I make that decision, not you. Yes, he said. Okay, she said, and looked back down. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer. The names, he said. Do they have names? A pause. Something moved across her face, a shift he couldn't fully read. Seo Yan, she said. Jia. And the boy is Tae-in. Seo Yan. Jia. Tae-in. His mother's family name woven into the first, and his own woven into the third. He understood what that meant. He understood how much it had cost her to give them those names when she was alone in Washington, and frightened and had every reason to erase any trace of the Jin family from the small lives she was building. He didn't say anything because there was nothing adequate. "Good night," Zuri said. The conversation was over. He went back to the secondary study and stood at the window looking at the dark garden and thought about his son's name and about Baek Sung-hwan's measured smile and about how completely and efficiently he had been made into an instrument of someone else's design. His phone buzzed at 9:47. Dae-jung. He picked up immediately. "We have the second number," Dae-jung said, and his voice had the particular flat quality it got when the information he was carrying was bad enough to require its own kind of careful handling. "The residential registration in the dead woman's name, we traced the actual usage pattern. Physical location pings from the call history put it inside a building we know." "Which building?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be meaningful. "The Mirai Tower office complex," Dae-jung said. "Floors 22 through 25, which are registered to Jin Group Holdings through the Daehan subsidiary." The air in the room went different. Jin Group Holdings, his own company. The legitimate corporate structure that sat over the entire financial operation, the layer of real business that gave the syndicate its public face and its legal protection. The Daehan subsidiary occupied 4 floors of Mirai Tower and employed 63 people who went to work every morning and filed taxes and believed for the most part that they worked for a legitimate investment holding company. Someone inside Jin Group Holdings itself. Inside the corporate structure, not the syndicate. Inside the part of his operation that was supposed to be clean, had been running a secondary line to a dead woman's registration and using it to coordinate with Baek Sung-hwan, and through Baek, with the Choi faction. "Can you narrow which floor?" he said. 24, Dae-jung said, "and I have a name." Tae-woo waited. "Cha Min-jun," Dae-jung said. "He's been with Jin Group Holdings for 9 years. Officially, he's a senior compliance officer." A compliance officer. The person responsible for ensuring that the legitimate business operation stayed clean, stayed legally protected, stayed above the line that the syndicate could not afford to cross. The man whose job, whose specific design function, was to protect Tae-woo from exactly this kind of infiltration. The man tasked with finding the rot had been the rot. Tae-woo stood at the window and did not say anything for a moment that was long enough that Dae-jung said his name quietly. "I'm here," Tae-woo said. "There's one more thing," Dae-jung said. Tae-woo waited again, and he was already bracing because the tone of those 4 words was the tone of a man who has been carrying the worst item for last. "Cha Min-jun has a meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning," Dae-jung said. "The calendar is internal, logged through the holdings system. It shows a routine compliance review, but the secondary line had traffic tonight, 30 minutes ago, and based on the location ping of the receiving number." "Tell me," Tae-woo said. "The receiving device was inside this estate," Dae-jung said. "Inside the walls, in the last 30 minutes. The words landed one at a time. Inside the estate. Someone on the grounds, or someone with access to a device that was currently on the grounds, had received a call from Cha Min-jun's secondary line 30 minutes ago, while Tae-woo was standing in the nursery wing doorway listening to the names of his children. He turned away from the window and looked at the study door. "Lock down the gate records for the last 6 hours," he said. "Every vehicle, every person, every—" "Already running," Dae-jung said. And Dae-jung. His voice had gone very quiet. "Nobody leaves the estate tonight. Nobody. Not staff, not—" "Understood." He hung up. He stood in the center of the study with the phone in his hand and thought about who was inside these walls. His mother, Zuri, his children. Hyejin, who had gone to find Dae-jung and might still be somewhere on the property, the gate staff, the household staff, the security rotation, and someone among them, or something they were carrying, some device they didn't know had been compromised, had just told Cha Min-jun exactly where Tae-woo was tonight, which meant Baek Sung-hwan now knew. Which meant the calculation had changed in the last 30 minutes, and whatever Baek had been planning for tomorrow morning's compliance review meeting was now operating on accelerated timing. Tae-woo moved to the door. He needed to find his mother. He needed to find Dae-jung. He needed to know if the device ping could be narrowed to a specific location on the property. But most of all, with a clarity that cut through every other operational priority, He needed to make sure that the nursery wing had two of his best people standing outside its door before another 10 minutes passed. Because whoever was inside these walls had just confirmed his location to a man who had every reason to make sure that Taewoo's children never became old enough to inherit anything. He stepped into the corridor, and the house that had felt like shelter an hour ago felt suddenly, entirely like something else, like a perimeter that had already been. He was already moving when he hit the corridor. Not running. Running inside a house with a compromised security perimeter was how you announced yourself to whoever was watching. But moving fast, his shoulder close to the wall, his hand at the inside of his jacket. The corridor lights were at their nighttime setting, low and directional, which put half the hallway in shadow and made every doorway a potential problem. He passed the first two without slowing. Third door on the left was the secondary kitchen, closed. He kept moving. His phone was already at his ear. The security rotation chief, a former military man named Oh Se-jin, picked up on the first ring. Nursery wing, Taewoo said. 2 people on the door right now, not in rotation, dedicated, stationary, nobody moves from that position until I personally relieve them. Do it now. Yes, sir. No questions. That was why he kept Se-jin. And I need a full count of every person currently inside the estate walls. Every person. Staff, guests, contractors, security. I want a name and a location for every warm body in the next 8 minutes. Understood. He hung up and kept walking. The question of the device, the compromised device that had pinged from inside the estate walls, was the most urgent problem and also the most delicate one. If the person carrying it knew they'd been identified, they would either run or accelerate whatever they'd been positioned to do. Either outcome was bad. He needed to locate the device before the person holding it understood that the net was closing. He found Dae-jung at the east entrance, standing with a tablet and the controlled expression of a man managing a cascade. "Where is it?" Taewoo said without preamble. Last strong ping put it in the staff wing, east corridor, 2nd floor. Dae-jung turned the tablet to show him a floor plan with a blinking indicator. It's moved twice in the last 6 minutes. Whoever has it is not staying still. Moving toward or away from the nursery wing, Dae-jung looked at him steadily. Toward, slowly. Could be coincidental routing. It's not coincidental. No, Dae-jung agreed, it's probably not. Taewoo looked at the floor plan. The staff wing's 2nd floor connected to the main house through a junction corridor that ran adjacent to and shared one wall with what? The northeast section. The nursery wing's northwest corner. Whoever was moving through the staff wing with that device was taking the most indirect route from the east entrance to the nursery. The route that didn't pass any of the main security checkpoints. Someone who knew the house. Who has access to the staff wing's 2nd floor, he said. Household staff, senior security. And Dae-jung paused. Invited guests are sometimes routed through there when the main guest quarters are occupied. It's the secondary accommodation corridor. Who is in secondary accommodation tonight? Dae-jung looked at his tablet. Looked up. Hyejin. The name sat in the air between them, and Taewoo's first reaction was not what he expected. It wasn't fury. It was something quieter and much more exhausted. The feeling of a man who has already revised his understanding of a person once tonight and is now being asked to revise it again, further down, into territory he didn't want to go. She gave Dae-jung all of her documentation, he said, and he could hear himself wanting it to be exculpatory. She said she would, Dae-jung said carefully. She hasn't yet. He moved. The staff wing staircase was at the far end of the east entrance corridor, behind a door that required a staff access card. Taewoo used his master override, took the stairs 2 at a time, and entered the 2nd floor corridor moving fast and quiet. The corridor was dim and empty looking. 4 doors on the left, 3 on the right, a window at the far end that showed the dark garden below. He stopped, listened. Somewhere ahead of him, behind one of those doors, was a person with a compromised device who had been moving through this corridor 30 seconds ago. He heard breathing that wasn't his. It was coming from the 2nd door on the left. He could see from where he stood that the door wasn't fully latched. A thin bar of darker shadow where the frame gap was, barely visible but there. He crossed to it in 4 steps and pushed it open. Hyejin was standing in the middle of the room with her jacket on and a bag at her feet, and she was holding her phone in both hands, and the expression on her face when she saw him was not guilt. It was terror, but not the kind directed at him. He had enough experience with fear in all its varieties to read that immediately. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of something that had happened in the last few minutes that had nothing to do with his arrival. "What happened?" he said. "He knows I gave you the forged authorization," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and it had a quality of barely controlled something that he recognized as the edge of panic being held together by whatever reserve she had left. "Sung Hwan, he sent me a message 20 minutes ago from a number I didn't recognize." "Show me." She turned the phone. The message was 3 lines. He read it. The first line said, "You made your choice." The second line said, "The children are a loose thread." The third line gave an address, a business address in Yoido that Tae-woo recognized immediately as a property owned through 4 layers of corporate structure by the Choi faction's real estate arm. He looked up from the phone. "He's telling you where he is," Tae-woo said slowly. "He's telling you the address. He's telling me where to go if I want to fix this," Hye-jin said. "He thinks I'll go. He thinks I'll—" She stopped. "He doesn't know I already gave you everything. He thinks he still has leverage on me because I still have exposure from what I did to Zuri. He thinks I'll choose myself over—" "Give me the phone," he said. She handed it over. He forwarded the message to Dae-jung with a single line. "Verify this address, full surveillance, no contact." Then he looked at Hye-jin. "You weren't moving toward the nursery wing." "I was going to the service exit," she said. "I was going to go to that address." "Why?" She looked at him with those cracked open eyes. "Because he said the children are a loose thread, Tae-woo, and that means he's telling me that he can reach them. That's not a threat in the abstract. That's a man telling me the location of the problem and the solution in the same message and expecting me to be afraid enough to do what he wants." She put her hands flat at her sides. "I was afraid enough. I was walking out that door. And now you're here," she said. "And I don't know what that means for either of us." He thought for exactly 3 seconds. "Stay in this room," he said. "Do not move. Do not contact anyone. Do not open that door until I send Sejin to you. You understand?" "Yes." He left. Back in the main corridor, he called Dae-jung. "I need the estate in full lockdown, nobody in or out. And I need you to get me everything on the Yoido address from that message in the next 20 minutes. "Already running," Dae-jung said. "But Tae-woo, there's something else." The tone again, that specific flat quality. "Say it." "The compliance meeting that Cha Min-jun had scheduled for tomorrow morning at Jin Group Holdings," Dae-jung said. "I pulled the attendee list. It's not a routine compliance review. The meeting is with the Financial Supervisory Service, 3 FSS investigators." A pause. "The documentation they've been sent in advance of the meeting includes altered financial records from the last 2 years, altered by Cha Min-jun, working from Inside Holdings." Another pause. "The records show systematic laundering activity traced to your personal authorization signature." The corridor was very still. "They're going to walk into that meeting tomorrow morning," Tae-woo said, "with forged records and my signature." "Yes." "And with 3 FSS investigators at the table, it becomes a regulatory event, not an internal matter. It goes public." "Yes." "Which is the legitimate business side of the attack," Tae-woo said, and he could hear himself working through it with a kind of cold mechanical clarity that had taken over from everything else, the way it always did when the situation got bad enough that his emotions simply could not afford to be in the room anymore. Baek moves against the syndicate. Cha moves against the corporate structure, both at the same time. They've been building toward a simultaneous strike, hit the criminal operation from inside, and collapse the legitimate business through regulatory exposure. "I can't fight both fronts with the same tools." "No," Dae-jung said. "You can't." "How long do I have before the FSS investigators arrive at that meeting?" 9 hours and 40 minutes. He stopped walking. 9 hours. To dismantle a 2-year operation that had been designed specifically around his vulnerabilities, by people who knew those vulnerabilities better than almost anyone. 9 hours to produce documentation sufficient to prevent a regulatory strike against his corporate structure while simultaneously neutralizing Baek Sung-hwan before the syndicate moved against his family. "Call Han Young-soo," he said. Han was his corporate legal counsel, a man who kept hours that suited emergencies. Tell him to meet me at Holdings in 2 hours. We need to build a counter record tonight. And Beck comes after the FSS problem is contained, he said. If we move on Beck first, Cha moves up his timeline on the FSS meeting. We deal with the legal exposure first, and then we deal with Beck. Understood. He went to find his mother. Madame Seo was in his main study when he got there, sitting in the high-back chair she had used for 30 years of difficult conversations, with a cup of tea that had clearly gone cold some time ago, and an expression that told him she had already been told most of what had happened by sources that operated on a timeline he couldn't fully account for. The FSS meeting, she said when he walked in. You know, I suspected there was a regulatory component. Cha Min-jun's appointment to Holdings was Sung Hwan's recommendation. I flagged it at the time. She set down the teacup. Your father disagreed with my assessment. You told my father. Your father believes Sung Hwan had earned his position, she said. Not defensively, just the fact. He was not wrong that Sung Hwan had earned something. He was wrong about what? Tae-woo sat down across from her, which he rarely did. He usually stood in this room. Tonight, he didn't have the remaining architecture for it. The children, he said. Sejin has 2 people on the nursery wing door and 2 more on the exterior of that section of the building, she said. Zuri has been told there is a security adjustment and that it is precautionary. Her eyes were steady. She did not accept that framing. What did she say? She said she'd heard that word precautionary before, and it had cost her 9 months of her life. His mother's expression held something complicated in it. She is with the children. She is not panicking, but she is not calm either. I need to go to Seoul tonight, he said. Holdings, legal counsel, I have 9 hours. I know what you need to do, his mother said. The estate has to hold. The estate will hold, she said. I have held this estate through things you have no knowledge of. Go. He stood. He paused at the door. The message Sung Hwan sent Hae-jin, he said. The children are a loose thread. He sent that message knowing that she might show it to me. He might have wanted me to see it. His mother looked at him. He's trying to move me, Tae-woo said. He wants me focused on the physical threat to the children so that I'm not focused on the FSS meeting. If I spend the night securing the estate, I don't spend the night building the counter record. Yes, his mother said. That's likely correct. So the message is either a real threat or a manipulation designed to neutralize me by making me treat it as one. Yes. And if I assume it's a manipulation and it's actually real, then the children are at risk, she said. And if I assume it's real and it's actually a manipulation, then the corporate structure collapses in 9 hours and takes everything with it, she said, including what you'd be protecting them from. The silence in the study was absolute. He stood at the door and looked at his mother, and she looked back at him, and neither of them spoke because the problem did not have a verbal solution. It had only a choice, and the choice had no version that felt like solid ground. I'll have Sejin double the rotation, he said finally. And I'll have Dae-jung put 2 people at the Yeouido address, in case Sung Hwan moves from there. But I go to Seoul. Yes, his mother said. If anything changes here, you'll know in 30 seconds, she said. He left. In the car on the way to Seoul, with Sung-il driving and the city lights beginning to appear through the rain-wet windows, he called Dae-jung again. The Yeouido address, he said. Did you put people on it? 2 cars. Dae-jung said. Static observation. They've been there 11 minutes. A pause. Tae-woo, there's no activity at that address. What do you mean no activity? The building is dark, no vehicles, no foot traffic. We ran the ownership twice and the property hasn't been occupied since a tenancy ended 4 months ago. Another pause, longer. Sung Hwan sent Hae-jin a ghost address. He stared out the window at the city. He knew we'd put surveillance on it, he said. Yes. He wanted to know how we'd respond, how quickly we could mobilize. A cold understanding settling. He was testing our reaction time, seeing how many resources we'd pull to cover an empty building at night versus... His phone buzzed. Different line. Sejin's direct number. He switched over immediately. Report. Sir. Sejin's voice was controlled in a way that meant the control was costing him something. We have a vehicle we can't account for. It entered the estate grounds approximately 35 minutes ago in the maintenance bay window. The 20-minute gap in the northwest gate camera rotation that was scheduled for a firmware update. 35 minutes ago, while Tae-woo had been talking to Hye-jin in the staff wing room, while the gate camera had been dark. "The vehicle," he said. "It's a maintenance van registered to the landscaping contractor. We've confirmed the actual contractor has no scheduled work tonight, and their van is in their own yard." Sejin's voice. "We have an unaccounted vehicle inside the estate perimeter, and we cannot currently locate it." The city lights outside the car window kept coming. "Turn around," he said to Sung-il. Sung-il was already braking. "Sejin," he said into the phone, and his voice had gone to that particular register, the one that had nothing performative in it, nothing for the room. The voice he only used when the calculation had reached the place where he wasn't thinking about leverage or strategy anymore, but about something much more direct. "Get to the nursery wing. Move everyone you have to that position right now." "Already moving, sir." "Stay on the line." The car had reversed direction on the highway overpass, and Sung-il was pushing the engine harder than he usually did, which meant Sung-il had done his own calculation and arrived at the same place. The rain on the windshield was heavier now, the wipers going fast, the city lights smearing into lines as the car accelerated and the estate road turned in the distance. 35 minutes. An unaccounted vehicle inside his walls for 35 minutes while he had been inside the house, while his mother had been in the study, while Zuri had been in the nursery wing with his 3-week-old children who had come home from the NICU 8 days ago. He had chosen Seoul. He had done the calculation and chosen the corporate problem and put Sejin on the perimeter and told himself the children were protected. He could hear Sejin's breathing on the line, fast and close, a man moving through a building quickly. He could hear the sound of the estate in the background, the doors, the corridors, the specific acoustic signature of the house he had grown up in. And underneath all of it, from somewhere that sounded like the northeast section, somewhere close to where the nursery wing stood in the dark with 2 men on its door and his children inside. A sound he couldn't immediately identify. Then Sejin's voice, sharp and controlled. "Contact. Northwest exterior. 2. The line went to static. Tae-woo was looking at the phone in his hand in the back of the accelerating car, watching the call timer freeze, and the estate road was visible now through the windshield, the stone walls rising in the headlights, and the gate was still 300 meters ahead, and Sung-il was driving as fast as the road allowed, and the phone in his hand was completely... The gate took 4 seconds to open. 4 seconds where Tae-woo sat in the back of the car with a dead phone line and the stone walls of the estate filling the windshield, and every one of those seconds had a physical weight to it, a pressing density that he felt against his sternum, like a hand pushing him back into the seat. Then the gate moved and Sung-il drove through before it was fully open, the side mirror clipping the iron edge with a sound like a gunshot, and the car was on the inner road accelerating toward the main house, with the gravel spraying up under the chassis and the headlights cutting hard through the rain. Tae-woo was out of the car before it fully stopped. He hit the east entrance at a run, through the door, down the main corridor, his dress shoes on the stone floor making sounds he didn't register. He passed the formal dining room, the secondary study, the northeast junction. The corridor that led to the nursery wing was ahead of him, and he could see from 40 meters away that the 2 men Sejin had stationed at the nursery door were not at the door. One of them was on the floor, not dead. He was moving, trying to get up, one hand braced on the wall, the other pressed to the side of his head. The second guard was nowhere visible. The door to the nursery wing was not fully closed. It was open perhaps 20 centimeters, and from inside the wing came sounds that Tae-woo processed in pieces as he closed the remaining distance. Voices, a struggle, something ceramic hitting the floor and breaking, and underneath all of it, cutting through everything like a frequency that bypassed every trained response and reached something older and more absolute. His children crying. He hit the door with his shoulder. The nursery wing anteroom was chaos in the contained specific way of a space where a physical altercation had recently occurred. A side table overturned, a lamp on the floor still lit, casting hard sideways shadows. The door to the main nursery room was open, and he went through it. There were 2 men he didn't recognize standing inside the room. Both large, both wearing the dark clothing of people who had intended not to be seen. One of them had Seijin against the wall with a forearm across his throat. Seijin was fighting it, feet scrambling for purchase, hands locked on the arm across his neck. But he was losing ground. The second man was between Taewoo and the cribs. Zuri was also between Taewoo and the cribs. She was standing with her back to the crib rail, her arms spread wide across it, blocking access, and she was not moving. Her face was the face of a woman who had made a decision that had nothing to do with self-preservation. The second man was a head taller than her and had his hand extended toward her arm, not yet grabbing, the gesture of someone who had expected compliance and was recalculating. The crying was coming from all three cribs. All three. High and thin and urgent, the sound of newborns registering distress without language, without context, with nothing but the raw signal of wrong. Taewoo crossed the room in 3 steps. He hit the second man from the side before the man fully turned, shoulder to ribcage, driving his weight through it, taking them both into the wall. The man was bigger, but Taewoo had the angle and the momentum and the specific quality of violence that comes from a man who has just run 40 meters at full speed on the fuel of something that has no name in any language except the one the body speaks when what it loves is being threatened. They hit the wall hard. The man grunted. Taewoo got an elbow up into the man's chin before he could recover, felt the impact travel up through his forearm, felt the man's head snap back. A return strike caught him across the cheekbone, hard, professional, from someone who knew what he was doing. And Taewoo's vision went white at the edges for 1 second, and his knees tried to buckle, and he did not let them. He grabbed the man's collar with both hands and drove his head into the wall once, twice. The second time the man's legs went and he slid, Taewoo turned. Seijin had gotten leverage on the first man while the room's attention had shifted, had broken the forearm across his throat by dropping his weight suddenly, and had the man's wrist now in a two-handed lock, driving it upward against the joint's natural direction. The first man made a sound that was not quite a word, and Seijin applied more pressure, and the man went down to one knee. The room went still. Taewoo was breathing hard. He could feel his heartbeat in his cheekbone where the strike had landed. He could also feel that his right hand was bleeding from something he hadn't registered, a cut across the palm from the edge of something during the wall impact, not deep but bleeding freely. He closed his hand into a fist and ignored it. He looked at Zuri. She had not moved from the crib rail, both arms still back against it, still in that posture of absolute refusal. She was breathing fast and her eyes were too bright in the overturned lamplight, and she was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read in full. Too many things in it at once, too layered. "Are you hurt?" he said. His voice came out rougher than he expected. She looked at him for a full second before answering. "No," she said. "The children. They're okay." Her voice broke on the word okay. Not with weakness, with the specific fracture that comes when an enormous controlled tension releases a fraction. "They're scared, they're crying, but they're—" She stopped and turned and looked at the cribs, checking them herself even as she said it, her hand going to the nearest rail, and he saw her touch Tae-in's crib first, and then Jia's, and then Seo-yeon's, and with each touch, her breathing steadied incrementally. Seijin had the first man zip-tied with something from his jacket and was on his radio. The second man on the floor near the wall was not unconscious, but was not attempting to rise. Taewoo looked at him. "Where is Baek Sung-hwan?" he said. The man looked at the floor. Taewoo crouched down in front of him, not close enough to be grabbed, just close enough to be direct. His hand was still bleeding. He could feel the warmth of it against his palm. "I'll ask you once more," he said. Silence. "Seijin," he said, and Seijin pulled the man up to sitting by the collar and held him there. And Taewoo looked at the man's face. Late 30s, professional bearing even in this condition. The specific flatness of someone who had done this work for a long time and had training for exactly this scenario, and understood that this man was not going to answer him in this room. He stood up. His phone was buzzing. Dae-jung. "Talk," he said. "Baek is moving." Dae-jung's voice was fast and tight. "He left the Yeouido area an hour ago. We didn't have eyes on him until 20 minutes ago because he used a vehicle we hadn't flagged. It's registered to a shell company 3 levels deep. He's in a motorcade, 3 vehicles, heading southeast on the 47. Southeast from Yeouido. The 47 highway." Taewoo ran the geography in his head. "He's coming here," he said. "He's 22 minutes out," Dae-jung said. And Tae Woo, Cha Min-jun, left the Mirai Tower building 40 minutes ago. He's not at the Holdings address. We've lost track of him. 2 moving pieces simultaneously, Bayek closing on the estate, Cha unaccounted. The FSS meeting, Tae-woo said, still scheduled for 6:45 a.m., 4 hours from now. He looked at the room around him. His children in their cribs, Zuri with her hand on the rail, Se-jin with 2 men secured and already on his radio calling for additional personnel. The lamp still on the floor throwing its hard sideways light. He thought for exactly the length of one full breath. "How many people can you get to the estate road in the next 15 minutes?" he said to Dae-jung. "I have 8 men, 12 minutes out. I need them on the approach road, not at the gate. On the road. Stop the motorcade before it reaches the property." A pause. "Non-lethal, if it's possible." "And if it's not?" "Then it's not," he said, and Cha. "Get Han Young-soo on the phone right now and have him begin filing an emergency injunction against the FSS meeting on the grounds of document fraud. I'll call the FSS investigative lead personally." He was already moving back toward the door. "See, Jin, this room stays locked. 2 people in here with Mrs. Jin and the children. Nobody in or out except me." He stopped. Zuri was looking at him. He had just called her Mrs. Jin in operational context without thinking about it, without the weight of choosing it, and from her expression she had heard it too and was doing something complicated and private with that information that he didn't have time to be present for. "Lock the door," he said to Se-jin, "from the inside." Then he was back at the corridor moving toward the east entrance, his phone at his ear, blood from his cut hand leaving a faint trace on the screen every time he adjusted his grip. He found Hae-jin in the east entrance hallway. She had come out of the staff wing, Se-jin's lockdown order apparently having reached the end of her compliance, and she was standing in the entrance corridor with her jacket and her bag and the expression of a woman who had decided something and was not walking it back. "Sung-hwan is 20 minutes out," Tae-woo said as he reached her. "I know. I heard Se-jin's radio." She fell into step beside him without being asked. "I have something." "What?" "The forged authorization Sung-hwan used to convince me you ordered my brother's death." She pulled a folded document from her jacket. "I kept the original, not a copy. The original document with his handling marks on it." She held it out. "I had it analyzed 3 hours ago by a forensic contact. The paper stock dates to approximately 4 years ago. The ink chemistry is consistent with a printer registered to the Choi faction's Gangnam office." She met his eyes. "He didn't just manipulate me. He used Choi faction materials to do it. It's a direct evidentiary link between Sung-hwan and Choi that your legal team can use in the morning." He took the document, looked at it, looked at her. "This and the forged financial records from Cha," he said. "Together they're enough," she said, "for the FSS meeting and for whatever comes after." He kept moving. She kept pace. "Why?" he said. "Because my brother was trying to bring this to you," she said flatly. "He died trying to do the right thing, and I spent 2 years believing he was the one who betrayed you. I am not letting Sung-hwan keep that." He nodded once. Outside, the rain had eased to something lighter, and the estate grounds had a new quality. The security rotation repositioned and visible. Lights on in sections that were usually dark at this hour. The property alert in a way that it hadn't been an hour ago. 2 additional vehicles had arrived through the east gate, and their personnel were deploying across the grounds with the efficient quiet of trained people who had been told what to expect. Tae-woo stood on the east portico steps and looked at the approach road where it disappeared between the pines. 22 minutes had become, by his estimate, 13. His phone rang. Different number. He didn't recognize it, but the area code was Seoul Metro, and he picked up. "Mr. Jin." The voice was male, middle-aged, carrying the specific cadence of a man accustomed to controlling conversations. "My name is Baek Sung-hwan. I believe you know who I am." Tae-woo said nothing. "I want you to understand," Baek said, "that what happened tonight inside your estate was not my preference. It was a contingency, a precaution." A pause. "You began pulling threads that were not yours to pull. I had to demonstrate that the threads run in both directions." "You sent men into my children's room," Tae-woo said. His voice was very quiet and very level. "I sent men to ensure that a conversation happened," Beck said. The same way your father used to ensure conversations happened. You're more like him than you know. You're going to tell me now, Tae-woo said, exactly where you are. A pause. Then a sound that was almost amusement. I'm approximately 8 minutes from your gate, Mr. Jin. I thought we should speak in person. Finish this properly. You're coming here. I've been coming here for 12 years, Beck said. You just didn't know it. A beat. I want to make a proposal. A clean arrangement. You walk away from the corporate exposure, I walk away from the syndicate operation. We formalize the division. No blood, no FSS investigation, no further contingencies. Tae-woo looked at the road between the pines. You want to divide my father's organization, he said. Your father's organization was divided the moment he refused to see what was in front of him, Beck said. And there was something real in his voice for the first time, something old and specific, a grievance with edges that had been sharpened over years. I built half of what stands under the Jin name, the financial architecture, the legitimate business layer, the political relationships that keep the regulatory agencies manageable. That was my work. Your father took that work and named it after his own family and gave his son the keys and told me to keep the engine running. So this is about inheritance, Tae-woo said. This is about what's owed, Beck said. Come outside and talk to me. Man to man. No Sejin, no Daejong, just you. No, Tae-woo said. A pause. You're certain, Beck said. I'm certain. The line was quiet for a moment. When Beck spoke again, the almost amusement was gone, and what replaced it was something harder and much more considered. Then you should know, Beck said, that Cha Min-jun is not at the FSS meeting location. He went somewhere else when he left Mirai Tower. Another pause, precise and deliberate. He's inside Seoul Metropolitan Police Headquarters right now, Mr. Jin, filing a comprehensive criminal complaint with documentation that has been building for 2 years. Not a regulatory matter, a criminal one. Organized crime statutes. Your name is at the top of the filing. A beat. That process began 17 minutes ago. It cannot be stopped by an injunction. It cannot be stopped by your corporate lawyers. It runs on its own timeline now, and that timeline ends with officers at your gate before morning. Tae-woo stood on the portico steps with the light rain on his face and the document from Hyejin in his hand and his cut palm bleeding steadily into his shirt cuff, and he thought about Cha Min-jun walking into a police building 17 minutes ago, and he thought about criminal filings and organized crime statutes and the particular irreversibility of a complaint once it entered that system. And he understood, with the cold, complete clarity of a man who has just seen the final configuration of a trap, that Baek Sung-hwan had never intended the FSS meeting to be the killing blow. The FSS meeting had been the decoy. The police filing was the real move. And it had been in motion for 17 minutes while Tae-woo had been running through his own corridors and fighting a man into a wall and calling Dae-jung about injunctions and thinking he was managing the situation. You've been 2 moves ahead, Tae-woo said. I've been 12 years ahead, Beck said. The motorcade's headlights appeared between the pines at the end of the approach road. 3 vehicles, exactly as Dae-jung had said, moving at a measured speed, not fast, not aggressive. The pace of a man arriving to conclude something. Tae-woo could see from where he stood that Dae-jung's 8 men were not on the approach road. Either they hadn't arrived or Baek had taken a route that bypassed their position. The motorcade was going to reach the gate. He stood on the portico steps and looked at the headlights coming through the rain and felt the weight of every piece of this. The 12 years, the forged documents, the filing already running in a police building across the city, his children 40 meters behind him, the woman who had called herself nothing but Mrs. Jin in his head for the last 2 hours standing inside a locked room with his son who had his name. He made a decision. He walked down the portico steps and crossed the flagstones and kept walking toward the gate. Hyejin appeared at his shoulder. "What are you doing?" she said. "Going to meet him." "You said no." "I changed my mind." He didn't slow. "Call Dae-jung. Tell him I need a direct line to the FSS investigative lead in the next 4 minutes, and I need Han Young-soo to begin a parallel process with the prosecution division, not the regulatory side. Criminal defense, not compliance. Tell him the complaint is already filed and we're past injunctions." He glanced at her. "And tell him to find Cha Min-jun. Tae-woo. The document you gave me, he said. The original. With Baek's handling marks and the Choi faction paper stock. I need that authenticated by someone whose name the FSS will recognize. Tonight. I have a forensic contact. Someone better than a contact, he said. I need someone with standing. She was quiet for 2 steps. I know someone. It'll cost. Call them. The gate was 30 meters ahead. The motorcade had stopped just outside it, engines running, headlights illuminating the gate bars and the wet stone of the wall and the pale gravel of the drive. The lead vehicle's door opened. Baek Sung-hwan stepped out. Tae-woo had known this man for 12 years, had sat at tables with him, had received counsel from him, had watched him work a room with the easy mastery of someone who understood exactly what each person in it needed to hear. Baek was 61 years old and looked younger, compact, well-kept, with the kind of contained physical presence that came from a lifetime of choosing his movements deliberately. He was wearing a dark overcoat and no expression that Tae-woo could read at this distance. He stopped on his side of the gate. Tae-woo stopped on his. 10 feet of iron bars and 12 years of accumulated architecture between them. Rain coming down light and steady on both sides. Open the gate, Baek said. No, Tae-woo said. Baek looked at him. Looked at Hyejin, a half step behind. Something moved across his face when he saw her, brief, recalculated. You brought her to this conversation, he said. She brought herself, Tae-woo said. You made a mistake with Hyejin. The document you used on her, you used Choi faction materials. That was sloppy. A silence. You can't authenticate that in time, Baek said. I have 4 minutes, Tae-woo said, and someone with standing. Baek looked at him through the gate bars and the rain in 12 years of carefully constructed distance, and Tae-woo looked back. And what passed between them in that moment was not the look of 2 men negotiating. It was the look of a man who had believed himself untouchable, discovering that the foundation under him had developed a crack that he had not placed there, and the look of a man who had just figured out exactly where to put his weight. You can't stop the police filing, Baek said. His voice had changed. Not lost, not that, but changed. Even with the authentication. The complaint is in the system. I'm not trying to stop it, Tae-woo said. Baek went very still. I'm going to let it run, Tae-woo said. And then I'm going to walk into that building myself, voluntarily, with Han Young-soo and a full counter-evidence package. And I'm going to sit in front of the investigator who takes Cha's complaint, and I'm going to show them documentation that puts Baek Sung-hwan and Cha Min-jun at the center of a 2-year criminal conspiracy to defraud the Jin Group Holdings corporate structure using forged instruments bearing my signature. He watched Baek's face, which is also a criminal filing, but mine has the Choi faction paper stock, and it has the original forged authorization with your handling marks on it, and it has 18 months of communication logs between your Singapore line and a phone registered to a dead woman. A beat. You have a complaint. I have evidence. The rain, the idling engines of the motorcade, the gate between them. Baek Sung-hwan stood very still for a long moment. Then he said quietly and with a precision that had not left his voice even now, "You'll destroy the organization doing this, taking criminal exposure public. The organization that you spent 12 years working to take from me," Tae-woo said. "Yes, I know what it costs. Your father built—" "My father is dead," Tae-woo said, and his voice did not waver. "And I have 3 children who are 3 weeks old, and I will burn every asset and every structure and every piece of what took 30 years to build before I let you sit in a cell somewhere with leverage over them." He held Baek's gaze through the iron bars. "That's the difference between you and me. You spent 12 years thinking I was protecting an empire. I'm protecting a family." Baek looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the gate, at the estate behind it, at Hyejin, at Tae-woo's face. Something in him, some carefully maintained architecture, shifted visibly. Not collapsed, but shifted. The way a wall shifts before it decides which way to fall. "I want counsel present," Baek said. "You can call them from inside, Yishum," Tae-woo said. "You're going to open those vehicles and your people are going to step out and put their hands where Sejin's people can see them, and then you and I are going to go inside this estate, and you are going to tell me everything. Every conversation, every name, every operation going back 12 years. And you are going to tell me all of it tonight, because the window between now and when the police arrive at this gate is the only window you have to give me something worth trading for. And if I don't, then Sejin opens the gate, Taewoo said, and we do this the other way. The motorcade engines idled, the rain came down. Baek Sung-hwan stood on his side of the gate with 12 years of architecture under his feet and the specific expression of a man who has just realized that the ground was never as solid as he built it, and that the person standing on the other side of these bars was not the man he had spent 12 years managing, was not the son who had grieved too long and trusted too easily and never once examined the hands that were on him, but something that had grown in the space of a single night into something he had. Baek Sung-hwan opened the gate himself, not because he was forced to, not because Sejin's people rushed the motorcade, or because the leverage had collapsed entirely in that single moment at the iron bars. He opened it because he was 61 years old and had spent 12 years carrying the weight of a long game that had just reached its final move, and the particular exhaustion of that, the specific gravity of a man who has maintained a performance for longer than any performance was designed to last, was visible in the way he pushed the gate bar aside and stepped through. Deliberate. Measured. The dignity of a man choosing the terms of his own surrender rather than having them chosen for him. His people stayed with the vehicles. He had spoken to them through the car window in low tones for approximately 40 seconds, and they had listened and they had stayed. Whatever he had said to them, they accepted it. That was its own kind of information about how completely Baek had controlled the world immediately around him. He walked through the gate and stopped in front of Taewoo. Up close, in the estate's exterior lighting with the rain on both their faces, he looked older than he had at dinner 6 weeks ago. Or maybe Taewoo was just seeing him with different equipment now. Inside, Taewoo said. They walked inside. Sejin fell in 2 steps behind Baek without being asked. Hyejin kept pace with Taewoo. None of them spoke on the walk through the east entrance and down the main corridor to the secondary study, which had become, over the last 12 hours, the operational center of everything that was happening. The timeline was still spread across the table. The lamp in the corner was still on from earlier. The room smelled of coffee that had gone cold, and the particular close air of people who had been working through a night. Baek sat down at the study table without being told to. He looked at the timeline on the table, looked at it carefully, the way an architect looks at someone else's drawing of a building he designed, and then he looked up at Taewoo. "You want all of it," he said. "All of it," Taewoo said. "Going back to the beginning." "The beginning," Baek said, and something moved across his face that was not quite a smile and not quite grief. "The beginning was your father." He talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Taewoo sat across from him and did not interrupt except to clarify specific names or dates, and Sejin recorded everything on the device Daejung had sent inside with one of the arriving personnel, and Hyejin sat at the far end of the table and listened with the particular quality of attention of someone who is hearing the shape of something they have lived through from the outside for the first time. Twice she made notes. Once she corrected a date that Baek had wrong, and the look he gave her when she corrected him had more respect in it than anything else he showed during those hours, which said something about the kind of mind he had. Even now, even here, he recognized precision and could not help responding to it. What came out over those hours was this. 12 years ago, when Taewoo's father was consolidating the legitimate business layer of the Jin operation, Baek had been the primary architect of the financial structure. That was true and had never been hidden. What had been hidden was the arrangement Baek had negotiated in parallel with the Choi faction's founder, a man who was now dead, whereby Baek would provide ongoing intelligence about the Jin syndicate's financial vulnerabilities in exchange for a guaranteed position at the executive level of whatever organization emerged when the inevitable generational transfer happened. He had not been working against the Jin family so much as positioning himself to survive the transfer with his influence intact, which, in his own accounting, had always seemed reasonable. 12 years of reasonable had become something else gradually, the way things do when the small adjustments compound. Cha Min-jun had been his recruit, placed inside Jin Group Holdings 7 years ago with the specific function of maintaining the documentation trail that gave Baek ongoing leverage. The communication architecture, Singapore, Macau, the dead woman's residential line, had been Cha's design. Beck gave him credit for it without warmth. Taewoo's father. Beck was quiet for a long time before he spoke about that. He spoke about it without the measured cadence he'd used for everything else. He said that the cardiac event had been real, that he had not ordered anything, that the man had died of his own heart in his own bed, but that he had known the stress he was applying to the Jin patriarch in those final months had been significant, and that he had not reduced it, and that the line between those two things was a line he had been aware of and had chosen not to examine. He said it plainly, without dressing it. Taewoo sat with that and said nothing. Yejin's brother had died because he had found the edge of what Cha was doing inside Holdings and had been preparing to bring it forward. That death had been Cha's operation, not Baek's, but Baek had known about it within 48 hours and had said nothing. He had used the death instead, had used it as the instrument to control Jin, to turn her grief and her manufactured certainty into a tool against Zuri. That was the thing that sat most heavily in the room as he described it. Not the systemic financial fraud, not the political maneuvering, the specific human calculation of taking a woman's destroyed brother and making her into a weapon with it. Yejin did not look at Beck during that part. She looked at the table. At 4:47 in the morning, Taewoo stood up and went to the window and called Han Young-soo. The call lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, he stood at the window for a moment with the dark garden below him, beginning to show the first flat gray of pre-dawn. The rain finally done. The estate quiet in a way it hadn't been since he'd arrived yesterday evening. He turned back to the room. "You're going to put everything you told me in a signed declaration," he said to Beck. "Han Young-soo will draft the form. You'll sign before 6 a.m. "And in exchange," Beck said. "In exchange, the declaration goes to the FSS and to the prosecution division simultaneously with Han's counterfiling. Your cooperation is documented. That's all I can give you. I don't control what they do with it." He held Baek's gaze. "But I won't add my own complaint to the stack. The evidence I have stays as defense material, not prosecution." Beck was quiet for a moment. "That's not much," he said. "No," Taewoo said. "It isn't." Another moment. Then Beck nodded, once, with the finality of a man who has arrived at the last available door and is going through it. Han Young-soo arrived at 5:15 with 2 associates and a case that suggested he had been awake all night regardless of this call. He was a small, precise man in his 60s who had practiced law for 30 years specifically in the space where legitimate business and its shadow counterpart met, and he read the room in approximately 4 seconds and set his case on the table and began working without preamble. Taewoo left them to it. He walked down the main corridor slowly, his jacket removed somewhere in the last few hours, his shirt sleeves rolled up, the cut on his right palm bandaged with the basic kit that Sejin had produced at some point after the nursery confrontation. The house was beginning to stir around him, staff moving quietly through the lower floor, the security rotation changing over, the thin light of early morning coming through the east windows. He went to the nursery wing. Sejin's 2 people were still at the door. They stepped aside. He knocked on the frame. Nothing for a moment. Then Zuri's voice, low. "Come in." She was in the rocking chair between the 2nd and 3rd crib, and she was awake. And she had clearly been awake for most of the night. Tae-in was in her arms, not feeding, just held, in the specific purposeless way of a woman who needed to be holding something or needed something to be held. Seo-yeon and Ji-ah were asleep in their cribs. The room was warm and dim and had the particular quality of a space where nothing violent had ever happened, which was something the room had earned back in the hours since the overturned lamp and the broken ceramic and the men who had stood between Zuri and the cribs. He pulled the chair from the corner and sat down across from her. She looked at him, at the bandaged hand, at his face, which he knew showed the night he'd had in ways he wasn't managing to conceal. "Is it done?" she said. "The immediate part," he said. "The rest takes weeks, maybe months." "Baek is in the study with my lawyer." She absorbed that. Looked down at Tae-in. The boy was awake, or nearly, his eyes open in that unfocused way of very new humans who are looking at the world without yet having the apparatus to categorize it. "He has your hands," Zuri said quietly. "The shape of them." Taewoo looked at his son's hands, the tiny fingers loose and uncurled against Zuri's arm. He looked at them for a long time. "I'm going to hold a press conference," he said. "Today if I can, tomorrow if not. I'm going to state publicly that the financial records that were filed with the police were fraudulent and provide the counter documentation. And I'm going to—" He paused. "I'm going to disclose that I have children, that you are their mother, that the circumstances of your removal from the country were the result of manipulated intelligence and constitute a wrong I am responsible for, regardless of who manufactured it. Boris Zuri looked at him. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know. A press conference makes them public. It makes the children—" "It takes away the leverage," he said. "As long as they're a secret, they're a target. If I make it public, I control the disclosure and I remove the value of using them as pressure." He looked at her steadily. "And it's the truth. The truth is that I deported my pregnant wife because I took a forged report over her word. Making that public is what it costs me. I'm going to pay it." She was quiet for a long moment. Taein made a small sound and she adjusted him automatically. The motion fluid and practiced, and in the adjustment her eyes came back up to Taewoo's face. "I'm not coming back to you," she said. Her voice was neither harsh nor soft. It had the quality of something that had been decided a long time ago in a different city, in a different circumstance, and had not changed. "I want you to hear that clearly before anything else gets built on top of it." "I hear you," he said. "What I'm willing to do," she said, "is be here, in this country, for the children." A pause. "I need to know they're safe. I need to know the structure around them is stable, and I need—" She stopped, and he could see her choosing words carefully the way she always had, that particular deliberateness that he had once mistaken for coolness and had eventually understood was precision. "I need to know that you are going to be in their lives as someone they can trust. Not because it's your bloodline, because you've earned it." "How?" he said. "You already know how," she said. "You come here, you learn them, you show up when it's inconvenient and when you're tired and when you'd rather be somewhere else, and you do it without expecting anything from me in return." She looked at him directly. "You be their father, not their patriarch, their father." He nodded. She looked at him for a moment longer, as if measuring whether the nod was real or whether it was the automatic agreement of a man trying to manage a situation. Whatever she found in his face, she held. "Okay," she said. Outside the nursery window, the sky had completed its transition from gray to the pale thin blue of early morning. The garden below was still and wet, the water garden surface catching the new light and giving it back in flat silver pieces. At 6:43 a.m., Han Young-soo filed the counter-documentation with both the FSS and the Metropolitan Police Prosecution Division. Beck's signed declaration went with it. The FSS investigators who arrived at Mirai Tower at 6:45 for the scheduled meeting found instead a notice of filing and a letter from Jin Group Holdings' legal team requesting the meeting be rescheduled pending review of fraudulent documentation submitted on behalf of a former employee. They rescheduled. Chamin-jun was located at 8:20 a.m. at an apartment in Mapo, registered to a woman who turned out to be his cousin. He was brought in by Metropolitan Police on the strength of the counterfiling, which had moved with a speed that surprised even Han Young-soo. The forensic documentation Hyejin had produced, the Choi faction paper stock, the handling marks, was authenticated by 7:15 by the contact she had called from the estate driveway. A retired criminal forensics examiner with 30 years of standing, whose name the FSS recognized without hesitation. Cha talked within 4 hours of being taken in. "People like Cha always talked," Daejung said when he called with the update, "because people like Cha were architects, not soldiers. They had built things, and they wanted credit for them, even in the structure of their own legal destruction." What Cha provided corroborated everything Baek had said and added dimensions that even Baek had not fully disclosed, including the specific operational timeline of how the Zuri operation had been constructed, step by step, document by document, the particular care that had gone into curating the surveillance photographs, the deliberate selection of Marcus Webb as a convincing figure to place her proximity to. It had been an elegant piece of engineering. Cha described it with something that was recognizably pride, and every person in the room where he said it understood that the elegance was also a specific and very human cruelty applied to a specific and very real woman. That detail made it into the prosecution file. The press conference happened the following morning. Tae-woo held it at the Jin Group Holdings building in the Mirai Tower, standing at a podium in a conference room with Han Young-soo to his left and Dae-jung somewhere near the back of the room, and approximately 30 journalists who had been given 48 hours notice and had come regardless. He had slept 5 hours between the estate and this room. He was wearing a suit that fit, and a face that he had stopped trying to manage into anything other than what it was. He read the prepared statement first. The financial fraud, the forged records, the coordinated attack on the corporate structure. He named Cha Min-jun and named the Choi faction connection. He described the evidence and where it had been filed. He spoke for 11 minutes in the flat, precise language of legal disclosure, and the journalists took notes, and none of this was the thing they had come for. Then he set the prepared statement aside. He said that 9 months ago he had signed deportation papers against his wife based on intelligence that had been manufactured by people working against his family's interests. He said that he had not verified the intelligence himself. He said that she had been pregnant when he did this, and had not known, but that his ignorance did not constitute a defense, only an explanation of how thoroughly he had been managed and how thoroughly he had allowed it. He said that he had 3 children who were 4 weeks old, that their mother was Zuri Coleman, an American woman who had been in Korea legally, who had been in his family legitimately, and who had been removed from the country through a process that he now understood to have been constructed specifically to isolate him and undermine the stability of his family. He said her name clearly and without qualification. He said that he was taking full public responsibility for the failure of judgment that had made all of this possible, and that responsibility was not a word he was using tactically. It was the accurate word for what he owed. He did not say he was sorry, not in that room, not to journalists. Some things were owed to specific people in specific rooms, and this was not the room. When the questions came, he answered the ones about the fraud and the legal proceedings, and declined the ones about his marriage and his children's future. And when a journalist at the back asked whether he was stepping down from operational leadership of Jin Group Holdings, he said no and gave no further explanation, and the conference ended. He sat in a car outside the building for a few minutes before telling Sung-il to drive. His phone had 47 messages. He didn't look at them. He told Sung-il to take the estate road. 3 weeks passed. They had the quality of very long and very short times simultaneously. The days were dense, filled with the particular compressed work of rebuilding a compromised operation and managing a legal process that was going to take years to fully resolve. And they were also interspersed with hours at the estate that had a different texture entirely, a slower grain. Tae-woo came to the estate every morning, not always for long, sometimes an hour, sometimes 3. He came without bodyguards in the house, which had required a conversation with Se-jin that Se-jin had not enjoyed but had accepted. He came and he sat in the nursery wing, and he learned things. He learned that Seo-yeon, the oldest by 4 minutes, had a specific cry that was different from the other 2. Slightly higher, slightly more insistent, the cry of a person who had already developed opinions. He learned that Jia was the one who settled fastest when held against a shoulder, and that the particular angle of the hold mattered, and that getting the angle wrong would undo the settling immediately. He learned that Tae-in slept most consistently between 2 and 5 in the afternoon and was most wakeful in the early morning hours, which was inconvenient for everyone and seemed to suit him fine. He learned these things by doing them, by sitting in the rocking chair or standing at the crib rail, or eventually taking each infant in turn with the particular terrified care of a man who was holding something irreplaceable and knew it. He got it wrong regularly. He asked questions without pride and received answers without them being softened, which was the only way either of them had ever worked, and which was, in its own way, a kind of continuity. Zuri watched him learn. She didn't stay in the room every time. After the first week, she would sometimes leave him with one of the infants and the certified nurse his mother had retained and go do something else in the house. Eat a real meal, sleep for an uninterrupted hour, walk in the garden. She came back and checked. She always came back and checked. But she left. That was something. On the 22nd day, Madame Seomira called her grandson into the main study. He sat across from her at the desk that had been their location for difficult conversations since he was a child, and she poured tea for both of them without asking, which was her version of ceremony. Hyejin has been cooperating with the prosecution fully, she said. I know, he said. The exposure she carries from her role in what happened to Zuri is significant, she said. The prosecution will likely offer her a reduced arrangement in exchange for her testimony against Cha and the Choi faction contacts. She'll carry a record. She won't be able to return to this kind of work. I know, he said again. She came to see Zuri, his mother said. He looked up. 3 days ago. She came to the estate and asked to speak with her. His mother's hands were still around her teacup. Zuri agreed to see her. He was quiet. I don't know what was said, his mother continued. Zuri didn't tell me and I didn't ask, but Hyejin left and she didn't look like someone who had been told what she needed to hear. She looked like someone who had been told the truth, which is a different thing. He thought about that. And Zuri, he said. Zuri cooked dinner that night, his mother said, for the first time since she's been here. She came into my kitchen and made something her mother used to make, she told me, and she fed it to 3 members of staff who happened to be there and did not ask for explanations. She looked at him. She seemed lighter. He held that image for a moment, then he nodded and drank his tea. He went to the nursery wing after. Zuri was feeding Tae-in when he arrived, and he knocked and entered and sat in the corner chair without saying anything, and she didn't tell him to leave, which was its own language between 2 people who had been communicating in silences for longer than either of them had intended. After a while, she said, I called my mother last night. How is she? He said. She told me I should come home, Zuri said. She said I've been over there long enough and I should pack the babies and come back to Washington and let Korea sort out its own problems. A beat. What did you tell her? He said. I told her the kids had a father who was learning to hold them right, she said, and that I wasn't done watching to see if it stuck. He looked at her. She was looking at Tae-in. The morning light through the nursery window fell across both of them. The particular slant of it at this hour, the way it made the room look like the kind of room that had always been this way, that had always been warm and occupied and full of the sounds of small people insisting on their own existence. And is it, he said, sticking? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Ask me in a month, she said. He nodded. Outside the window, the water garden caught the morning light and gave it back silver. Madame Seo Mira stood in the corridor outside the nursery door for a moment before continuing on her way, and what she felt as she stood there, hearing the sounds of the room, the low voices, the infant sounds, the specific audible texture of something being carefully rebuilt, was not satisfaction exactly. It was older than satisfaction. It was the feeling of a woman who had held the pieces of something important through a very long winter and had lived to see the first specific evidence that the holding had meant something. She walked on. In the weeks that followed, the legal proceedings ground forward in the way legal proceedings do, without drama, without resolution, with the particular slow machinery of institutions processing what people had done to each other and deciding what to call it. Baek Sung-hwan's declaration served him as promised: reduced exposure, documented cooperation, a process that would take years and end with something less than what Cha Min-jun would receive. Cha received the full weight of what he had built and would spend a significant portion of his foreseeable future in a room considerably less comfortable than any he had designed. The Choi faction lost 3 mid-level operators to the prosecution process and went quiet in the way organizations go quiet when they are recalibrating after an exposed operation. They did not move against the Jin family again, at least not in the period this story covers. Jin Group Holdings underwent a compliance restructuring that Han Young-soo managed with the specific thoroughness of a man who understood that the best time to clean a house was while the inspection was already happening. 3 executives departed. 2 new appointments were made from outside the organization, people with no legacy relationships, people who owed nothing to anyone already in the room. Dae-jung was elevated formally to a title that had previously been informal. He accepted it without ceremony. Hyejin left Seoul. She went somewhere along the south coast. Tae-woo heard this through Dae-jung, who had heard it from Se-jin, who had not specified how he knew. She did not ask for anything from anyone before she went. She had left a letter for Tae-woo with the estate staff, 1 page, which said that she understood that understanding was not the same as forgiveness, and that she was not asking for either, But she wanted him to know that the last thing her brother had said to her before he went to look into the holdings discrepancy was that Tae-woo Jin was a man worth protecting. She wanted him to know that she believed now that her brother had been right. Tae-woo read the letter once and put it in the inner pocket of his jacket and kept it there. On the 31st day after his return to the estate, he arrived in the morning to find Zuri in the water garden. She was sitting on the stone bench near the east edge of the garden with Seo Yeon in the carrier on her chest and Jia in a small portable seat beside her. And she was doing nothing in particular, looking at the water, the morning light, the garden around her with the patient attention of someone who has discovered a quality of stillness they didn't previously have access to. She looked up when she heard his footsteps on the flagstones. He sat on the other end of the bench. They sat in the morning quiet for a while, the water garden between them doing its flat silver thing, the sounds of the estate beginning its day somewhere behind them. "I keep thinking about Washington," she said eventually, "those months. The apartment in Columbia Heights. I had this one window that got the afternoon light, and I used to sit in front of it and try to figure out what I was going to do." She paused. "I was so angry. For a long time I was just purely angry in a way I'd never been before. Not at you specifically, at the whole shape of what had happened." He listened. "And then the babies started moving," she said, "and the anger didn't go away, but it had to share the space with something else." She looked at the water. "I didn't name them until after they were born. I kept thinking I'd decide and then I'd look at them and the names weren't right yet." A pause. "The morning after Seoyeon was born, I looked at her and I thought, she doesn't have anything to do with what happened to me. She just showed up. She just arrived and she needed a name and she needed someone to be her mother, and that was going to be me regardless of every other thing that was true." He sat with that. "I put your name in Tae-in's," she said, "not because I forgave you, because he deserved to know where he came from." He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him sidelong. It was not a warm look, and it was not a hard look. It was the look of a woman deciding incrementally what she was willing to let be true. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "You're still on the 30-day evaluation." "And tomorrow," he said. She looked back at the water garden. "Tomorrow is day 32, she said. "We'll see." Seoyeon made a sound in the carrier. That high, specific sound, opinionated, impatient. Zuri adjusted her automatically. The sound settled. Tae-woo sat on the stone bench in the morning light of his mother's garden with the woman he had failed and the daughter he was still becoming a father to. And he did not say anything else, and neither did she. And the day came up around them steady and clear, and the water garden held the light the way it always had, indifferently, beautifully, as if it had been doing this forever and would continue long after every complicated human thing that had been built and broken and painstakingly reassembled in these walls was finally, completely, done. It was enough for now. It was more than he had earned and less than he intended to deserve. And the distance between those two things was the only road left, and he was going to walk it, every day, starting now.